Цієї роботи видав книжку про власне села цього регіону. Це така одночасно фотографічне і антропологічне дослідження. Також Джейсон багато працював у Сполучених Штатах Америки, зокрема розробляв проекти про китайські квартали різних американських міст. Але його увагу завжди привертало питання єврейської спадщини, зокрема в регіоні власне Центрально-Східної Європи. І останні роки Джейсон в основному працює з цими питаннями, з питаннями історичної пам'яті, з питаннями пошуків свого коріння євреями з усього світу. І, зокрема, його зацікавив регіон такий, як Галичина. Останні кілька років він дуже багато працює власне тут. І результатом його роботи, зокрема, стала виставка в Єврейському музеї ЛЕКЦІЯ, який знаходиться в Кракові. Виставка називається «Незакінчена пам'ять». Вона, власне, представляє сліди єврейського минулого в сучасному ландшафті Галичини, в культурному антропологічному ландшафті. Сьогодні він представить лише частково власне свої проекти, котрі пов'язані з історичною пам'яттю. Назва цієї лекції має такий досить провокативну назву – це «Боротьба з пам'яттю». І, власне, ми сподіваємося почути, чому саме боротьба і з чим сьогодні в нашому регіоні нам потрібно в такому метафоричному сенсі боротися. Запрошуємо Джейсона до слова. Дякую.
Can everyone hear me? Yes? Good. Let me address the title right away. Wrestling with memory, or struggling with memory, wrestling with memory. Many of you will remember the story from the Torah, from the Bible that Jews and Christians share about Jacob wrestling with an angel, the patriarch Jacob wrestling with an angel. Jacob wrestles with an angel for an entire night, which in the context of the Bible is an indeterminate amount of time. A very, very long time in a very dark place. He wrestles and wrestles and wrestles with the angel. And by the time the morning light is coming, the angel has not won. And so the angel cripples Jacob. And at that time also gives Jacob a new name. And Jacob becomes Israel, which means in Hebrew, the one who wrestles with God and prevails. And at that point, Jacob lets the angel go, and Jacob, as the Torah has it, walks with a limp for the rest of his life to remember this episode. So, for me, being Jewish has always been about wrestling with Jewish meaning, Jewish history, Jewish memory, and this is true for me as a religious Jew, but it's also true in my photographic work. So I could say that in a sense the title of this talk is taken or makes reference to this ancient story that Jews have inherited. I'm from the United States. I come from San Francisco, and my family, both sides of my family came from Ukraine, or what's today Ukraine. They came from central Ukraine, and some of them came from Moldova, from Bessarabia. Jews like me, who have roots in this part of the world, have a particular dilemma, or at least I've always experienced this particular dilemma, which is to say, we have a deep connection to this part of Europe, but we have no homeland here. Unlike, say, Ukrainians, or Poles, or Russians, or others, who can, in some sense, claim membership in the countries that have come to exist. Jews like me have an ancestral past that does not result in membership in any straightforward sense. Actually, I can tell a small anecdote about this. A few months ago, I was walking in Philadelphia in the United States, and I got into a conversation with a man on the street, which often happens to me. And he was speaking with a Russian accent, and I asked him where he came from. And he said, "Oh, you wouldn't know." I said, try me, I might know. He says, oh, this little place called Kishinev. I said, Kishinev? That's where my family comes from, Kishinev. He said, do you know Kishinev? I said, yeah, my family, we're all Jews from Kishinev. He says, hold on a second. He goes into a shop next to where I'm standing, and he says, Miriam, hey Miriam, come outside, there's a guy here from Kishinev. His wife comes out, and he says, Miriam, this man is a Jew from Kishinev. I said, no, I'm not from Kishinev. I've never been to Kishinev. My family is from Kishinev. He says, and he keeps saying this, this man from Kishinev, this Jew from Kishinev. And finally I turned to him and I said, listen, sir, with all due respect, I'm not from Kishinev. And he turns to me and he says, how many generations were your people in Kishinev? 20? I said, I don't know. He says, 10? I said, I don't know. He says, so what's 2 that you weren't there? You're from Kishinev. This is he made the point in an interesting way. But the truth is that for me, and I think for a lot of American Jews from this part of the world, ancestry and inheritance of the Jewish past in this part of the world is not straightforward at all. And for me, I began, I think, looking for what that ancestry meant as a photographer about 20 years ago. And I spent about 10 years working on a project that became my first book on the subject, which I published about 10 years ago. The title of the book is called Far From Zion, with the subtitle Jews, Diaspora, Memory. And the book looks into places of Jewish life and of former Jewish life in North America and in Europe, mostly in Eastern Europe, with a question in mind, which was how to make sense of loss, or I would say of pervasive loss, which is an ancient Jewish theme. Usually it goes by the name diaspora or exile in Jewish tradition. But in the last 100 years, Jews have experienced loss in a profoundly concentrated way. Loss through migration, loss through genocide, loss through assimilation. Profound changes. I would say that if I had to argue that the changes to Jewish lifeways in the last 100 years or so, say since the time my ancestors left Eastern Europe, has been as concentrated and as ruthless as in any time in the last 2,000 years of Jewish history, since the fall of the temple. This is a picture that I made in one of my family's ancestral shtetls, a place in central Ukraine called Miena. This is the town from which one of my great-grandmothers left when she was 17. She traveled across Siberia by herself all the way to California. Her family, the ones who didn't leave, ended up in a mass grave in the Jewish cemetery here. And this is the house that my great-grandmother migrated to in San Francisco, to a small, very insular Jewish community living on the edge of the continent in a frontier town, in a sense clinging to freedom. And between Miena, again here, and San Francisco, there seemed to me to be a universe of Jewish problems, a universe of loss and of questions to me about how to make sense of it. I was never satisfied growing up as a Jew with simple explanations about what Jewish identity was comprised of. Certainly, faithfulness to Israel or Zionism was not an answer for me. I wanted something more, I wanted something deeper. And so I began to travel. And I began to discover that Jewish abandonment or Jewish forsakenness characterized a great deal of the landscape, not just in Europe, but in North America too. This is a picture that I made in Newark, New Jersey, whose Jewish community did what most Jewish communities in the United States have done in the last 100 years. They migrated with every generation and completely uprooted themselves physically, leapfrogging their way through American cities in a sort of condensed enactment of diasporic migrations over time. With this book, I wanted to put different kinds of pictures into relationship with each other. Pictures of places that were open-ended explorations of these places and of the sense of absence or loss that inheres in them. And also portraits of friends and sometimes of family whose faces seem to me to carry deep irresolution that they had inherited from unanswerable stories. Sometimes I found what seemed like whole family albums of the Jewish people in cemeteries across Eastern Europe. Sometimes, as in this picture, they seemed almost to hold the very earth up. I found small communities of Jews living sort of as my own ancestors did when they came to San Francisco, living in a tight and, in a way, dedicated way, but also very vulnerable way. Sometimes I encountered family moments or traditions that seemed particularly contradictory, as in this case, for example, a family friend, a Holocaust survivor at the bris bat, that is the dedication ceremony of his granddaughter, in which he holds the granddaughter full of knowledge that the granddaughter may or may not ever understand. Across Eastern Europe, I found, at this time, I found Jewish spaces that seemed slightly haunted. It seemed to me as if they were not quite tangibly inhabited by the ancestors. And actually figuring out what the status of the ancestors is in these places became a preoccupation for me. Jewish ruins abound everywhere in Eastern Europe and in North America, if you look for them. This is not a picture from Europe, a destroyed synagogue in Europe. This is Detroit, Michigan, in the United States. The urban blight that has come to occupy almost all of the city of Detroit also impacts Jewish heritage. And here, if you look carefully in this abandoned, forsaken synagogue, you can see the word God shining through the window in the door. A curious thing. The Holocaust was at the very center of this project. This is a photograph I made in 1999 in Poland at the site of the former camp of Birkenau, the largest of the Nazi death camps. This picture shows a swamp at the edge of the camp, which is filled with the ashes of burned bodies from 1944. Some uncountable number of corpses were burned and their ashes put here. This was at a time when the camp was operating with such ferocity that it was impossible to burn all of the dead bodies using the crematoria that were built. So open pyres were built and bodies were burned in the open air and then dumped in swamps. I visited several of these places in the 90s and began to grapple with what they meant, I think unsuccessfully. Sometimes I was taken to places by individuals, such as this man, Arkady Siegel from Vinica, who survived the roving death squads that came to his town in the summer of 1941 by playing dead and hiding under a pile of dead bodies. He took me to the place where those bodies lie in mass graves, and it took me to many places actually in Vinica that I never would have found by myself. Somehow between Arkady Siegel's face and the weathered face of an ancestor whose image clings to a tombstone. Somewhere in there, Jewish ancestry lay for me. Some years later, I began a project which is still ongoing, although I'm close to the end of it now, called Alive and Destroyed, in which I turned to the Holocaust explicitly or precisely, the very thing which I unsuccessfully encountered in my first, in the first book that I did. I began to look for experimental ways of photographing that would allow me to bring contradictions into a single image, contradictions of knowledge and of lack of knowledge, of encounter with that which was inexplicable and a desire to explain and see as much as possible. And the visual form that I arrived at for this was a picture which was partly focused and partly unfocused intentionally, in which a corridor of focus runs through the image in different orientations, in a sense illuminating with sharpness that which can be illuminated and leaving the rest unclaimed. Most of these pictures I made in Poland and in Ukraine over a period of 5 years or so. The pictures are accompanied by rather long texts, which I, for obvious reasons, did not include on the slides, that explain something of what the context of these images is. And I can maybe summarize some of them briefly. This is a photograph from a town in Poland called Przeworsk, which is in the far southeastern part of Poland. This is the Jewish cemetery in Przeworsk. This is a pile of ashes that was recovered from Majdanek, the camp in Majdanek. A giant urn from a day in November 1943 when 18,000 Jews imprisoned there were killed on a single day. This is the massacre site of the Jews of Zolochiv, Ukraine, not far from here. This is the site of an important arms factory that worked with slave labor in southern Poland, a place called Skodzisko-Kamienna. The subject of a recent book by Christopher Browning, if any of you know that scholar. Many of the places, in fact, most of the places in this project are almost forgotten, if not entirely forgotten, except by specialists. And part of my purpose with this work is to, in a sense, decentralize the image of the Holocaust, to move it past the familiar locations such as Auschwitz, the ghetto in Warsaw, and so forth, and to allow people to understand the true and extraordinary breadth of the Holocaust as it actually occurred. I mean, the truth is that if you can imagine a sheet of glass covering the entire continent of Europe, if that sheet were shattered, if the Holocaust is the shattering of that sheet, shards of glass went into every last corner, every last village, every last town. Recently, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum concluded a study in which they found 42,500 sites in which people were detained and murdered. 42,000 ghettos, camps, and so forth, across occupied Europe. An extraordinary number. When they began that study 7 years earlier, they thought that they had found most of them, and they had found 6,000. So I found my way into various places to make work which is historically informed, but my goal here really is to work as an artist and to try to find visual form for for knowledge and questions about knowledge both, to work both of them into photographs that are powerful, but whose meanings are in clear ways also unresolved. This is a picture that I made last winter here in Lviv, behind the prison that sits on the site of the former Yanovska Street camp. This is the Piaski Hill, the sand hill behind the prison, which is still part of the prison complex. This was the main massacre site for around 200,000 people who were imprisoned in the Yanovska Street camp. Apparently, although I haven't seen it myself, you don't have to dig very far before you find human bones still there in this site. I've also done many works of a more focused nature under the umbrella project of Alive and Destroyed. One of them that takes place here in Lviv itself concerns the life of Leszek Allerhand, who was a survivor from Lviv, came from a very important Jewish family here in pre-war Lviv, and who survived by really living as an urchin and running from place to place for a period of years during the occupation. This is Leszek here as an old man, and in the family photograph, he's the third from the left. Using a map marked with the sites that he fled to and hid in, I photographed those sites. Which are obviously, or let's say explicitly unmarked with Holocaust history, but in fact, all of them are connected to the story of this one boy's survival. Recently, I did another project which concerns the famous Golden Rose Synagogue, which is a combination of photographs, drawings, and text that looks at the Golden Rose and imagines also the Golden Rose that no longer exists. You can see this work currently on display on the fence next to the site of the Golden Rose. And it was opened about 2 weeks ago or so as, you could say, an inauguration of the changes that will soon happen to the site of the Golden Rose and the synagogue square that's adjacent to it. So, I guess I could make a distinction in my artistic practice between two kinds of work. One of them I might call documentary art, which is art that involves experimental visual forms to address a certain kind of depth of meaning. Work which is conceptually challenging, not easy to understand. Work that involves discrepancies between what one sees and what one knows. And work which puts questions before statements. Work in which what you see is not necessarily aligned with the claim of knowledge. And in fact, the failure of knowledge or the demands of non-comprehension are an important part of the work. By contrast, there's another side of my practice, which I'd like to turn to now, which I might call artful documentary, which is non-experimental in its visual form. Rather, it emphasizes clarity and directness of expression. The content of this kind of work may be challenging, but the work itself is not trying to be conceptually inventive. And most of the time, at least in my case, it's work of public history. It's analytic, its purpose is to impart knowledge and understanding in a direct way. This summer, to take one example, I've been at work on the former Nazi camp called Płaszów in Krakow. Here's a map showing the city of Krakow. And you can see marked in red at the bottom is the site of the former Płaszów camp. If any of you have seen the movie Schindler's List, Płaszów is the camp which is where the film is set. It's quite a large area. You can see it's, in fact, physically about as big as the old city of Krakow itself. This is what Płaszów looked like in 1943 when it was functioning as a camp. There were about 30,000 prisoners who were in residence there at the time. During the 2.5 years of its operation, 150,000 prisoners, mostly Jews, overwhelmingly Jews, passed through the camp, and an unknown number, probably at least 10,000, were murdered in many ways at the camp. At the camp, there are some memorials that you'll see if any of you ever go there. One large memorial that dates from 1964, a communist, from the communist period in Poland, was designed by the famous architect Witold Cieńkiewicz, and it consists of a large piece of stone with 5 figures, partly emerging and partly receding into it, and the text on the back simply reads, "In memory of the martyrs murdered by the Hitlerist perpetrators of genocide in the years 1943 to 1945, a rather generic text." Not far from it is another monument that was put, in a sense, to compensate for that, for the deficiencies of the communist era text and monument. And this newer one reads, "Here in this place in the years 1943 to 1945, several tens of thousands of Jews were tortured, murdered, and turned into ashes, brought here from all over Poland and Hungary. We do not know the names of the murdered. Let us replace them with one name, Jews. Here in this place, severe crimes were committed. Human language knows no words to describe the atrocity, the beastliness, the ruthlessness, and the cruelty. Let us replace them with one word, Hitlerism. The Jews who survived the Nazi genocide pay homage to the memory of those who were murdered, whose final scream of despair is Płaszow's silence." Very explicit text. Quite a good text, I think. This is what the camp looks like in winter. It's a vast, open territory. And it's the only major former Nazi camp in Poland which is not under the authority of any institution at all. It's mostly used as a site of recreation, actually, in the city. And so my work this summer was to understand what people know and what they don't know about Płaszów. By people's behavior, there are a lot of questions one could ask. On any particular day in Płaszów, you might see people sunbathing. You might see children at play and people walking their dogs. This is the site of the burning of almost 10,000 bodies. This very site where these children are playing. You'll see people drinking and having parties. Sometimes people pass out. You might see a New Age religious ritual, neo-pagan ritual at Płaszów. It's a good place to admire your motorcycle or go mountain biking. It's a good place for target practice or war games if you're a child. course, it's very good for dog walking. Now you can imagine this. You can imagine walking in Auschwitz, or I should ask, could you imagine walking, for example, at Auschwitz and seeing this? What would one think to see this at Auschwitz? And why would one see such a thing at Palo rather than at Auschwitz? People go here to spend time with their beloved, or simply to rest, to play with children. Again, this is the burning site of Palo, the game of frisbee, bicycles. It's rather extraordinary what one sees at Palo. So I set out to understand exactly what this meant. By contrast, there are other death camps in Poland which are not so afflicted. For example, at Sobibor, you see here the beginnings last fall of a major archaeological dig that is sponsored by the government of Poland, the federal government of Poland. This is the largest archaeological dig to have taken place in a former Nazi camp in Poland. The camp at Belzec is completely memorialized. It's entirely covered with a memorial, which covers the entire footprint of the former camp. This is inside the memorial, looking towards the site where the gas chambers of Belzec once stood. For those of you who may not know, Belzec was one of the primary death camps in occupied Poland, and it was the site where most Jews from Galicia were massacred. Around 600,000 Jews in less than a year were murdered at Belzec, with 1 or 2 survivors. A boulder field covers the site today. It's vast. And surrounding the boulder field, you can see a walkway with the names of each of the deportations to Belzec and the towns from which trains left and took condemned Jews to this place. If you walk the perimeter of the camp, you'll see several transports from this city, from Lviv. I photographed them all. I was there just a few weeks ago and I photographed them. You see them over and over again. In other places in Poland, you see Jewish heritage being renovated, restored, reclaimed, such as this synagogue in the Galician town of Romanov, which has been restored to look very much as it once looked. One can walk by this place today, and even though there are no Jews in Romanov, one can clearly understand what Jewish life looked like. Now it's a museum. It's a town museum. And there are many such examples that I've seen in Poland. This is in Szczecin, the renovated synagogue, which is a community hall and a theater. This is the synagogue in Zamość, renovated a few years ago. This is the interior of that synagogue. This is the synagogue complex at Vodava, which is on the Belarusian border, not far from Sobibor. The renovated synagogue in Krasnik, in the Lublin region. The renovated synagogue in Modliborzyce, also not far from Lublin. This is in Lublin itself, the renovated synagogue in the former yeshiva. There's a lot of work, there's a lot of initiative going on in Poland to reclaim its Jewish heritage. Of course, there's the famous Jewish Culture Festival, which is the largest in Europe. This year it had its 25th anniversary. It brings experts, educators, academics, artists, musicians, performers of all kinds together for a 10-day festival that culminates in a huge party in the historic Jewish quarter of Krakow in Kazimierz, with a stage. It's broadcast live on television, and it's very popular across Poland to watch it, and it is really a quite magnificent festival, organized by Poles, mostly. Now, in Ukraine, the situation is a little bit different. Last year, I spent several months traveling through Western Ukraine, Eastern Galicia, looking at the state of Jewish heritage here, and this resulted in an exhibition that's currently on view in Krakow at the Galicia Jewish Museum. There are initiatives like the ones in Poland that one can find here in Eastern Galicia. For example, there's the work of Michailo Vorobec of the town of Rohatyn. Vorobec is a local historian, you could say an activist historian, whose family grew up with the Jews of the town. The Jews of Rohatyn were about half of Rohatyn before the war. He witnessed the massacres of the Jews in his own town and subsequently dedicated himself to creating as complete a local history as possible, dedicated to the shared history of Jews and Poles and Ukrainians in Rohatyn. And he's done quite a remarkable job. Recently, he's partnered with an American organization to recover matzevas that are buried beneath the streets of his town and to return them to the Jewish cemetery, such as here, a pile of matzevas that's used to support a sewage pipe. And here are a few of the matzevas that Vorobec has returned to the cemetery, the new Jewish cemetery in his town. There are memorial projects that are happening in certain places across Eastern Galicia. This is a new memorial at the Jewish cemetery in Bravaruska, for example, quite an ambitious memorial comprised of a wall of matzevas. And if you look for them, you'll find several towns that have Holocaust memorials, usually in the Jewish cemeteries, but not always. This is the Holocaust memorial in the town of Zolochiv in Ukraine. This is quite an unusual one, actually. It's not near a town at all. It's on a hillside near Tarnopol in a place called Plemenivka. I had to hike a few kilometers into the countryside to find this one, but I found it. Here in Lviv is the largest memorial that you'll see in Eastern Galicia. This is just not very far from here, actually. It's on Chornobola Street, just under the railroad bridge. And it was spearheaded by Boris Dorfman, a local activist and historian. There are changes that are slowly coming to Lviv itself. The Golden Rose I mentioned a few minutes ago is the site of the new commemoration project, which is just getting underway now. I made this picture 2 days ago or so of the scaffolding that's been put at the site to begin to reclaim and implement a collaborative project that was approved in 2010. It's taken some time to get off the ground. But for the most part, if you travel through Eastern Galicia, this is what you see of Jewish heritage. This is the state. And in overview, this is the state of Jewish heritage in Eastern Galicia. This is the broken, raped Jewish cemetery in Berejane, the high synagogue of Pithaitzi, whose backside was made into a marketplace during the communist period, which has now itself been abandoned. The building is completely blasted out. This is the Jewish cemetery in Borislav near Drohobych, a garbage pile. This is the former center of the town of Belz, which was once a great Jewish community. the site of the High Synagogue in Zolochiv, which is now just an empty lot behind a bus stand with no marker, as is the case in most of these places. This is the site of the former suburban synagogue in Sambir, next to a stinking creek. This is the Krakivsky market here in Lviv, which is built atop the old Jewish cemetery